Welcome to this webinar about approaches to opening up digital cultural heritage. It's going to be Masha and myself moderating the webinar, and we've got the pleasure to have with us Karin Glassman, Digital Coordinator at the National Museum Sweden, Evelyn Heidel, a longtime member of Creative Commons working at the Open Lab Initiative, and Dr. Andrea Wallace, Senior Lecturer at the University of Exeter. Just a quick reminder that this webinar is part of a longer webinar series about copyright when sharing data with Europeana. This is the third one of the series, and the last one, for those that could not attend, was about clearing rights in collections. So we had Naomi Korn tell us a couple of tips that an institution can use to clear copyright before they even start thinking of sharing content online, for instance, with Europeana, including tips to deal with orphan works. And the fourth webinar of this series, which will take place in December, will focus on the copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive and will be led by Paul Keller. So as you know, this directive is currently being implemented across member states, and it contains some important provisions that are likely to have an impact in your institution, and namely in being able to clear rights a bit more easily with the out-of-commerce works provisions, or having to respect the public domain with the provision in Article 14. So during that webinar, if you're interested in knowing a bit more about that. Just before I hand it over to Masha, a quick recap of the rules to participate in this webinar. We're recording this webinar. I think, are we recording it? Yeah. Cool. And then we're using Zoom for webinars, so everyone's audio and video is not visible except for the ones that are participating as speakers. But you can participate actively by using the chat to introduce yourself, sharing some thoughts, and if you have questions for the speakers, you can type them anytime, preferably through the Q&A, so that we can monitor them a bit more easily. And the recording will be made available in the coming days. So over to you, Masha.
Okay, thanks for this introduction. So as already mentioned, this is the third webinar in the series. In the first two, we talked about labeling digital assets when submitting content to Europeana and clearing rights. And today we want to talk to you more about the principles when it comes to labeling digital assets, and specifically about Open GLAM methodology and open access. So we are going to talk about Europeana. We're going to hear about the case study from the National Museum in Sweden. And we're not going to talk about benefits only, but also tackle the challenges and the barriers that many institutions are facing when thinking about embracing Open GLAM. At Europeana, we firmly believe that digital cultural heritage should be accessible to everyone. But it's not enough to just put the data and content online. It's also about making it as openly accessible and freely reusable as possible. That's why we're using CC0 for the metadata, which means that anyone can use metadata published by Europeana for any purpose. And we even expose the metadata through public APIs, which means that our end users can then build new interfaces, portals, and applications using the metadata we ingest and publish. We ask our providers to label all digital assets that are submitted to Europeana. So this means that every image, audio, video has a label, which is either a Creative Commons license, Creative Commons public domain tool, or one of the rightstatements.org. And this tells our users what they can or cannot do with the objects on Europeana. And while labeling the assets, we also ask providers to respect the public domain. Public domain consists of works that were never protected by copyright or where the copyright protection has expired. And the slavish copies of of objects in the public domain should stay in the public domain. So in other words, digitization does not create new rights, and we ask our providers to respect that. And you can read more about that in the Europeana Public Domain Charter, where we also mention that why the public domain is so important for innovation and creation. And finally, where possible, we also ask our providers to choose open rights statements for in-copyright objects. So if they have permission from the rights holder, or if they themselves are the rights holder, we ask them if they're willing to open up and choose those rights statements that allow free reuse. We work with cultural heritage institutions from across Europe. Some of them are small, some of them have digital departments, some don't. They're in different places when it comes to embracing open access and Open GLAM methodology. On Europeana Pro, you can find a series of interviews with institutions that have opened up. They were conducted by my colleagues, and it's a really interesting read. So I would invite you to go ahead and have a look. But when reading those interviews, what really stood out to me is how the institutions that have embraced open access are thinking about themselves and how their perspective about the users has changed. And if you have a look at those interviews, you will hear that these institutions think about themselves from the perspective of responsibilities they have towards the wider public and society. So the collections they hold belong to the society, so they see it as part of their mission to not just digitize objects, but to also make them freely reusable where possible and where those objects are no longer protected by copyright. They are also thinking about their collections from the perspective of end user. So they're bringing their collections to where the users are. They're writing blogs, they're sharing them on social media, they're collaborating with Wikipedia, Wikimedia, and they're doing all that so that their collections gain wider exposure. And in some cases, this led to commercial partnerships. In others, it informed academic research and led to new discoveries. But overall, all these institutions report that they feel that the benefits of embracing Open GLAM methodology outweigh the perceived risk of opening up. And I'm really glad that we have Karin with us today, and she will tell you a bit more about her own experience and experience of National Museum when they embraced Open GLAM.
Thank you very much, Masha. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I have 10 minutes now to quickly walk you through a development that took approximately 6 years. As Masha said, my name is Karin. I work at the National Museum in Sweden. And the National Museum is Sweden's largest and oldest museum of art. We were founded in 1866, housed a collection of 700,000 works of art. And we were closed for renovation in 2013 and reopened 5.5 years later in 2018 before we closed again because of the pandemic in spring 2020. And then we opened again in summer, and now we're closed again. So we thought this closing and opening up during the renovation was a one-time experience, but it turned out not to be. Next slide, please. As I said, I'm gonna walk you through a 6-year long development, and I think this is something to keep in mind, that when you think about Open GLAM and museum collection and museum or GLAM institutions, I think it's good to remember that it's a slow-moving world, and there will be times where you think that you have said things already, and you will have to repeat them a lot. So our journey started in 2014 when we started collaborating with Europeana. And because we're a large and traditional art collection institution, we started providing our data with Europeana, but the images were still put under total copyright. So as you can see there to the left, in 2014, we had an all rights reserved license applied to our images. And what was happening was that we were still already listening to what was happening around us. And I think that's also a good strategy to keep in mind. Just have a look what's happening around you, and if necessary, amplify those developments inside your own institutions. Because what happened with us was that when our data was available at Europeana, Wikimedia Sweden actually downloaded it to Wikidata. And of course, as our images were copyrighted in Europeana, what they did was they used the bad images that were around in the internet and that were free to reuse. So we were suddenly a large art collection which was available on Wikidata, but it was presented with very bad imagery. And that was something that we could use in the internal discussion to show, like, look, the images are already there. There's nothing we can, there's not so much we can do about this. The only thing we can do is make the situation better. And the next step was then that we actually changed the right statement to CC by SA, which made it a bit better, but this step actually passed quite unnoticed. And it wasn't before in 2016 when we actually started to collaborate more strategically and on a larger level with Wikimedia Sweden. And when we finally decided to upload around 3,000 images from our collection to Wikimedia Commons, which meant that the Wikidata assets also would get better images, and which also meant that we changed the right statement from CC by SA to actually providing those images into the open domain. And during these discussions, I think it's very important to make sure that the other departments actually understand that this is nothing that just belongs to digitization or just belongs to something like rights and reproductions, but actually parts like marketing and education and exhibition departments are just equally concerned of these developments. And now in 2020, I was so bold to say, like, National Museum everywhere. And what I mean with that is that the development towards the open access, but also what has been happening after we've taken the decision to actually provide open access to our collections, means exactly what Masha has said, that it's easier for us to understand our mission more adapted to a digital world, right? So we understand that our mission, our state-funded mission, is to promote art history, and especially to keep alive the older the older art, so to speak. And and the thing is that we now understand that success doesn't necessarily mean getting people into our building, but it means connecting them to our collection. And this only works when you let go of part of the control that you have over the collection. Next slide. So the next slide. Yeah. So here is just a quick walk through those discussions that we had, which were which included but weren't limited to the cost of the technical infrastructure, the lack of the lack of the funding, and the missing resources for metadata catalogization, but also the loss of income. So what do you do when people talk about the missing resources for digitization and metadata cataloging? As I said, we collaborated with existing infrastructures, such as the Wikimedia Foundation. If you get the next slide. So as I said, we uploaded about 3,000 images to Wikimedia Commons, and we provided a license statement that looked like this, which follows the Europeana public domain guidelines. And the next slide. And during the first week of being online, those images were viewed 104,000 times. They were put into 100 articles in 1 week. And in 6 weeks, they've had 400,000 views. Now they're in 7,000 articles in 40 different languages, and they've had 35 million views in 2020. So why this step that we took, saying, okay, we're going to open up our collections, got a massive PRR, more than anything we ever dreamt of. We got newspaper articles in Armenia, and we got reactions from Brazil. What is much more important is actually the long-term consequences that we see here, because suddenly we reach an audience who might get in contact with our collection without ever having to understand that there is something called the National Museum of Sweden, but they will still interact with the works of art, and that is partly also fulfilling our state-funded mission. And the next slide. So the next argument against open approach that you might encounter will be the loss of income that you're not being able to sell images anymore if you open up your collection. And we also experienced this discussion. It was a long and fierce discussion. In 2012, an internal report said that we should not stop selling images because we will lose too much money. And I think the point here is that you have to do a fair and realistic calculation. You really have to look at if there is money that is not going to be earned anymore, but you also have to look at what money it actually costs to provide those services. And if all else fails, I think it's very important to remember that you don't, opening up your collection doesn't mean you can never again sell images. What we do is, if you turn to the next slide. So what we do is we set a handling fee. As you can see here, if you can order images from the National Museum's homepage, you will get the information that you can actually have a look at Wikimedia Commons and see if the images that you are in need of are already there. But you can also decide to contact our Rights and Reproduction Department and to actually pay 1,000 euros, which is 1,000 crowns, which is 100 euros, for getting the image delivered to you from our staff. And there are quite a lot of people who still make use of that service, especially if they want to if they want to get the service of picking the right image to whatever they need. Okay, and the next slide. The last and the biggest argument is the concerns about morally inappropriate use of the artworks, or just generally the concern about inappropriate use, because that was something that kept turning up all the time again. But how do we know what people do with our works of art? How can we stop people doing this and that with our works of art? And the answer is you cannot. So you won't know all the uses that your works of art will be used for. And there's there might be ways to stop certain uses that you don't approve of, but the thing is that it's not a copyright question. So just because you don't like what people do with the images you're providing doesn't mean that you have to keep them in copyright. And the most important argument against this is that the question is, what is more dangerous for your collection, the collection that you're hosting? Is it that there might be inappropriate use, or is it that the collection will not be used at all? And the next slide. So, as I said, the thing about the inappropriate use is actually to turn the discussion a bit around and not thinking about what is the danger in doing this? Why would we be afraid of doing this? But more like, why should we do this? And one important point I tend to stress is that 46, according to an analysis from, I think it's 2017, is that 46 of people that do not participate in art or design museums offerings cited that it's not for someone like me as a barrier. And having this understanding around your collection, that you as the institution know what the appropriate use is exactly keeping this understanding that our collection is not for someone like you. So I guess it's important to understand that the digital sphere actually gives you a chance to really live up to the mission that most museums state, that this collection actually belongs to the public. If it belongs to the public, then the public should be allowed to interpret it in the way that they see fit. And the next slide. Then there might be an argument that you're not only concerned about the public use, but that you are a research institution. And there, I think the arguments of open access become even more important, because as you can see here, according to a report of the College Art Association, 1/3 of visual artists 1/5 of artists, more than half of editors, and more than 1/3 of art historians have avoided or abandoned work in their field because of copyright concerns. So if we, as the National Museum of Sweden, have the state-funded mission to foster and to promote art history, then we will have to make sure that researchers get the images they need and that they can make use of the images however they see fit in order to carry out their research. Okay, so why should you do this? Next slide. The thing is that if you open up your collection to other users, you will see users that you yourself cannot think of. Like this is one of my favorite applications. It's called Art Up Your Tab, and it's an add-on to a Chrome browser. What it does is that every time you open a new tab, it will provide you with an artwork. It's highly addictive. So if you actually install it, it might happen that you'll just open tabs all the time. But as you can see, it provides you with information, and it provides you with link to the institution and to Europeana from where this is harvested. And the next slide. 2 more examples about what can happen when you actually open up your collection is that we were contacted by the fantastic project called Scan the World, which is actually a funded project where a person travels the world with a 3D scanner and scans sculptures from art museums under the only precondition that what you have to do is you have to open the 3D scans for public reuse. And because this rhymes well with our open access policy, we got about 60 sculptures scanned from our collections, which are now available for whatever use you see fit. And as I said before, in 2020, the open license letter that the National Museum is everywhere. I have a lot of examples around that, but I just took an example from a well-known Swedish furniture supplier who actually used some of our open images to show fill a decoration. And what happened there was that people didn't ask the furniture supplier, where can I buy this drawer that you're showing in the image, but rather, where can I buy those prints? And fortunately enough, the public got the information that these are prints which you can actually download from the National Museum's homepage and just print and use however you see fit. So as I said, the most important thing is to think about the chances, but also you will have to tackle those risks and you will have to repeat your arguments a lot. And one pro tip that I never grow tired of saying is that if people don't listen to your arguments, have someone external say the same thing to your colleagues, because that might actually work a lot better. Right, and with that, I pass on to Scan and Andrea, I think.
Great. Thank you so much, Karin. And I think that there's not a lot that we can add to the things that you've said, because in a way you're putting out the practical examples of some of the stuff that we kind of like address in different situations. Sorry, I'm gonna try to close my window because there has been construction going on for the last year here, so it's always very noisy. Anyways. So what Andrea and myself are gonna try to talk about today briefly is about some of the evidence, I would say, that has been gathered around from the last 10 years of institutions doing open access. And then we're gonna do Mentimeter poll, because we love the Mentimeter polls. They are very engaging and people also find them fun. But basically what we want to give now is sort of a brief overview of some of the benefits and challenges that have been identified by institutions doing open access. And of course, I'll give the floor to Andrea also to talk a little bit more about the research, the paper that she has put together for the Declaration on Open Access to Cultural Heritage. So Andrea, do you want to explain a little bit about the PubPub?
Yeah, I want to also kind of play off of something you just said and everything that Karen just said, because it's something that we highlight in the PubPub. But one of the reasons I love everything that Karen ever says is because they've been tracking data, like they have actual data on all of this. And it takes time to do that. And I think it's kind of hard to then even slow down and reflect and write on it and collect it in a way that then allows you to either publish it, or how do we publish it, you know? And even if we do publish it, open access, we've got paywalls, right? So I think one of the things that we highlight in the PubPub is areas where it would be really useful to have additional data, because those are the arguments, the concrete arguments where you can show things that have come to fruition that really help convince the people. And I think also knowing what type of data is important is also something that we need to keep in mind. And one of the things that we consistently see is that argument around how much does it cost to manage a licensing department versus how much do you actually bring in. And I think that, trying to think about some of that in order to anticipate and then take that forward, maybe that would be something that we could, kind of talk about a little bit more, or even think about how we can start to collect that in a way that allows us to aggregate all that stuff that's going on and even publish in places like the Open GLAM Medium, where it reduces those barriers for everyone and kind of, helps us all crowdsource and use the hive mind to produce some data around this. So I just wanted to throw that out there. But when the PubPub specifically, so what we've been working on is this, the idea of putting together a declaration on open access for cultural heritage. And we don't use Open GLAM for the title of the declaration, because today, just as we saw with everything Karen discussed, there are so many different people and so many different organizations and even commercial organizations who are involved in the reproduction and dissemination of cultural heritage. And so there are a lot of copyright questions that need to be considered around that, especially from the institution side about making things available online. But some of that education and even the framing and how we discuss that with audiences, or some of the tensions and the imbalances when we talk to commercial partners, is something that we really need to focus on, I think, a bit more in terms of an Open GLAM ecosystem and community, rather than thinking about this within the GLAM kind of spectrum. So this is what we're attempting to do with the Open GLAM PubPub. And one second, I've got some very... So one thing that we're hoping to do is kind of, we wanted to start this in a way where we were opening up the floor and trying to crowdsource a declaration and do some research behind what we needed to do. And then of course, COVID happened and everyone's pulled in different directions, and there's so much going on. So Scan and I have been working with Creative Commons and Wikimedia Foundation to try to do the research and take this forward to get it to a point where we then have enough to go on to kind of shape the declaration and have a public consultation and talk around this. So if you go to the Open GLAM PubPub, you'll see that it's a way that we've kind of compartmentalized the various things that need to be addressed and need to be considered when we get to the point that we have something as a declaration that we can all talk about. And so the way that it's kind of framed is thinking about people who are kind of dipping their toes in Open GLAM at the moment, setting some really important, clear standards for going forward with all of this, and then even having sections on what the benefits are, what the challenges are, thinking about how we can do the arguments for people that we know are being asked because of the data so far, and also reflect on all of the stuff that has happened so far in the past 10 years of Open GLAM. But then also looking at some new areas, because there's some really important questions around decolonization, accessibility, and what that means, especially for digitally disabled audiences. We have questions around intangible cultural heritage and even user-generated intellectual property. So we're also developing kind of some groundwork and some foundations to start talking about some of these other interesting aspects of Open GLAM that really need to be considered, even when there's not a copyright issue, right? Because copyright is something that's just one component of everything else that we're doing. But this specific PubPub focuses on what happens when there are no copyright issues in the work that we're trying to make available online. So it's a very narrow focus on how do cultural institutions take the collections that they do have control over, because there's a lot of stuff we don't, and make that available. So I'll go back to you, Scan, if you want to kind of then walk through some of this.
I think that's great because it also speaks very well, that last bit that you said, to the fact that some of these are copyright questions, while some of those aren't copyright questions. And so you need to have clarity on which ones you can actually solve through having some sort of legal tool, and which ones are the ones that you should aim to some sort of community norms. And we'll get more into that when we talk about the challenges, right? But in terms of benefits, here we have put it like a list of benefits that GLAM institutions have reported. So the first one is like goodwill and recognition, which basically speaks to the fact that whenever an institution goes open access, then the public and in general, like the media and the press, actually gives it a lot of attention, and they receive a lot of like recognition basically for the work that they are doing in serving their mission better. And that speaks really to the second one that we have listed here. And you will notice that we're just making bullet points and not numbers, because this is not a ranking, right? And so actually it might be that for some institutions, the second point about enhance mission and relevance to 21st century audiences is probably like top on the list. And this is something that has been shared by so many institutions over and over when doing open access. Of course, Karin's own writing on the Medium Open GLAM, Inside the Museum is Outside the Museum, speaks a lot about this enhanced mission. Meret Sanderhoff, of course, has been very vocal about how the mission at the CMK changed after doing open access. The Met has also reported benefits around this, the Cleveland Museum of Art. And I think that my favorite sort of public speaking about this enhanced mission and relevance to 21st century audiences is Adam Moriarty's great sort of Medium post too about do we still need digital collections all online? And so if you haven't read that one, I think that's one of the best like arguments that I've seen around some of these like issues around enhanced mission and relevance to 21st century audiences. So there's a lot of reporting on the mission side, which is great. But also there's a lot of reporting on the last bullet point around fostering reuse and remix culture. And here I want to mention the work that Medhavi Gandhi has done in India with the Heritage Lab, because I think it's a great example of how you don't need to do huge things in order to participate in open access. So Medhavi entered in touch with the DAG museums, and they started participating in the Get It Up competition. They organized their own Get It Up India, and that went really well. And now the DAG museums want to keep on doing more of it, because that's like a good example of how open access can foster reuse and remix culture, and especially engagement in metrics that are important for GLAMs, in this case in social media. And if you want to read about that case study, we just published it this week in the Medium Open GLAM, right? But I think that there are like a lot of examples of this. As Karin mentioned, the Art Up Your Tab is a good example of that. The Coding Da Vinci, it's also a great example of that. We recently organized, well, I would say like Susana Anas did a great job organizing the Hack for Open GLAM at the Creative Commons Global Summit. And I think there are like a lot of different examples about how GLAM institutions see a lot of value whenever they put their cultural heritage online, and it gets reinterpreted in new engaging ways. Of course, the other point is the increased staff efficiency and better mission alignment. And this is something that Karin touches a lot in her Medium article about how sometimes like it's not only about like bringing your collections online and making them openly available, but also how open sort of changes the way in which your staff also organizes. How open also means collaboration, and how that collaboration needs to be made out more publicly and transparent for the people that are part of your institution, and how that actually increases staff efficiency, alongside with the fact that your staff doesn't have to be worrying about like, oh, can I use this? Can I not use this? We need to do licensing and this and that, right? And so this is one of the other things that has been reported by GLAM institutions as being very important. Of course, integration into external interfaces like Wikimedia Commons, as Karen was mentioning, but then there are a whole range of other external interfaces. And I think that, again, the example that Adam Moriarty gives in his talk is actually great, right? Pinterest, for example. And we're seeing more and more institutions going into Pinterest because it offers like a new range of ways of thinking about how the public can actually engage with some portions of your collections. And so very important, particularly for everything that has some like do-yourself crafty aspect to it. It's actually very interesting to look at. Of course, increased research and new knowledge around collections. And here I think that we can talk a lot about how Wikidata is bringing a new whole perspective into this new knowledge around collections. And I'm gonna share afterwards some of the work that Andrea, if you remember the name of the person that was at the National Gallery of Art that has now moved on. I cannot remember her name now, but anyways, I'm gonna share it right after I finish talking, right? But like there are a lot of new things that can be done once you release your metadata, release your artworks, visualizations, things that you weren't able to interrogate about your collection are now possible through making stuff openly licensed available. And of course, like the last one that I'm going to mention right now is inclusion in open educational resources, or OER. And this is great because it actually allows for integration with the education department that a GLAM institution might have, and how to sort of like work that out to actually increase the quality of some of the content that is being put into educational resources. So that's more or less some of the reported benefits that we've seen over and over. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm gonna briefly go through the challenges. And some of these challenges are the ones that Karen has already mentioned. There's a lot of fear around losing funding, losing revenues, changes in business models. There's also a very, like, I would say, very valid fear on liability and risk aversion. And this also speaks to the great tension that GLAM institutions typically face, that is that they are commissioned to steward and preserve works that for the most part, they don't have the rights to. And so that creates a lot of tension because they have to do a lot of activities that might involve making copies of a work, but then those activities might be restricted somehow by copyright. It's both like making copies and giving access to those works. And so that's like an interesting tension to analyze there. Of course, like part resolution copies and selling of copies of public domain works, that's also something that has come up as an important reported challenge that people have experienced with like third-party services that take those public domain works, then put a lot of watermarks on it and sell it to you on the internet for 20 euros or more. And then, of course, misuse of public domains works is also kind of a concern, right, that we've seen appear. And here, community norms are super important to actually try to educate the public whenever a misuse might be happening. Of course, wrong, messy, or inaccurate metadata or information. And I would encourage everyone to look at the FAQ that the Smithsonian has put together on how they deal with inaccurate metadata. I'm going to share some of these links of the things that I'm saying here on the challenges, but I want to go quickly through them. And it's great because it's basically acknowledging that sometimes you will have inaccurate metadata due to historical reasons, and those perceptions might change with time, right? And I think that's kind of a good acknowledgement of what are the things that you can do, even when you might not feel as comfortable with some of the information that you are releasing as open access. And of course, the last one is lack of attribution to the institution that did the digitalization, so lack of recognition to the work that the institution has done. So if we can go now to the second slide, and we're going to invite you to the Mentimeter poll. So if you could go to menti.com and use the code 6837939, we're going to paste that in the chat too, so you can actually have it more easily available, and sort of help us understand better what are the things that you consider that are more important whenever, like, sort of more important when talking about the challenges and the benefits. And in the meanwhile, while you're very entertained filling that poll, I'm gonna try to remember the blog post that I was thinking about.
And while you're voting, I would also like to mention that we have a question from Ilias, and it's exactly about the type of question we hear a lot at Europeana. So institutions using Creative Commons licenses for digital objects that are in public domain. And I think we will definitely address this later on when we comment on the results of the Mentimeter. And Karin, if you have any advice, you can also unmute yourself and go ahead after the voting.
Yeah, do you want me to answer it while people are voting now? Yeah, okay. So the question was here that that there's a lot of fear around other people making money. So it says, like, we have often the problem of trying to persuade participating institutions that a CC&C non-commercial shouldn't be used by the institutions. And what arguments do I have to tell such institutions that feel reserved when thinking that someone else is making money out of their collection? And so at National Museum, this has also been a long discussion, but we have arrived at this attitude that we say, like, well, if someone has this brilliant idea that really makes a lot of money out of our collection, this will be good for our collection as well, because our collection will be spread and we can congratulate this person to his or her great idea, and we'll make sure that we sell the products in our museum as well. So I think there's no way in sort of making sure that no one else is making money out of your collection if you open it up. But the question is, how will this money harm you? Because I think what people need to differentiate is that only because someone opens a business case on the museum's collection doesn't mean that this automatically means less income for the museum. So an example that I have from our sister institution in Denmark, the Statsmuseum for Kunst, is that I talked to their provider of, like an online museum shop, and a thing that they sell a lot is prints from the open collection of the SMK. This is something that does not make sense to me, but it does make sense to a lot of people, right? So the collection is open, you can just download it and print it yourself, but people still want to buy the prints from the museum. And I think this is true for a lot of services, that we should have some trust in our own brands as museum. Just because someone else is selling like cups with the Mona Lisa somewhere on a marketplace, it doesn't mean that the Louvre will sell less reproductions of the Mona Lisa. I think this is very important to remember.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I also want to add that what happens normally too is that the fact that an institution feels that they should put a CC BY and C to work doesn't mean that they are actually right. So you basically have to have rights in order to make a copyright claim, and CC licenses are copyright claims. And so we have actually wrote something to that effect on last year, I think it was, on Creative Commons blog, as a way to sort of clarify some of the common mistakes that institutions are kind of, or wouldn't call it like mistakes, but some of the assumptions that institutions have on how they can claim copyrights over public domain artworks, right? And so in order to have like a claim, you actually have to have some sort of like legal basis or foundation to claim that copyright, right? And that's in short what the non-commercial or whatever other CC license ends up doing, right? It's a copyright claim. And I think that the situation is gonna, or what we're sort of expecting too, is that with the Article 14 of the Digital Single Market Directive coming into force, hopefully there's going to be some legal clarification on that. But there's also going to be a lot of work to make sure that, you know, the different stakeholders, from ministries to legislators to then implementers, actually understand what is the thing that is remaining in the public domain, because there seems to be a lot of discussion around some of these issues, right? So I think that we sort of have the results, right? So the first one, that it, yeah, I mean, there's 40 something people in the call, but some people might not be very tempted to participate, and that's fine. So we see that the first one is liability and risk aversion, and then the second one is funding, losing revenues, and changes in business models, lack of attribution to the institution that did the digitalization, misuse of public domain works, wrong, messy, or inaccurate metadata or information, and the sixth is bad resolution copies and selling of copies of public domain works. Sorry. Do we want to go to the next question in the poll, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
So now we're asking you to like sort of tell us what do you think are the, in order of importance to your institution, the most important benefits that you see from open access.
Can I just jump in and say something about the non-commercial comment too? Because I think it's the difference between commercial and non-commercial, which is one of the primary hangups from making the move from non-commercial licenses over to the open territory. And I think it's really difficult because I don't, how do you make, how do you convince people who clearly are hung up about that specific sort of thing, which could be valid because it could be seen as like a revenue source. But I think some of what has already been discussed is, you know, it's going to deter a lot of good work, a lot of people who want to use a collection, but they see the non-commercial license because how non-commercial, even though Creative Commons has said this is how non-commercial exists for the license, there's a lot of activity from one country to the next that may or may not be commercial. It's a weird category and it's a weird distinction that creates a perception of liability for the user. So people may avoid using stuff, you know, completely to begin with, because it also can't be incorporated into Wikimedia Commons and things like that. But also going back to kind of what Scan said about Article 14, there's going to be a lot of legacy issues that come from taking, you know, kind of cautious approaches to moving forward to open, because when you apply the non-commercial license to all of the images and then release them, if Article 14 then says, guess what, there's no more rights in these images, we have to go back and do a lot more kind of data work, or they're out there anyway with the non-commercial license attached to them. And I think, you know, trying to future-proof and trying to think about, like, instead of the here and now, what sort of costs are we preventing by kind of aligning with some of the things in the directions that we know where they're going, is where we should really be thinking. And also thinking about, you know, the future curators and the future rights and reproduction people who are going to be managing some of this content, trying to reduce the costs and the barriers for them, which will then make all of our lives a lot easier. So that's just what I wanted to add to that.
No, I think that's a great point, and also speaks to the challenge that we were seeing right around liability and risk aversion, right? Because the liability and risk aversion is also kind of like sitting in a complicated scenario, right? Because we know that copyright laws are actually not very mindful of the activities that GLAM institutions are doing in a day-to-day basis. But in order to actually be able to change the um, course, I would say, of how copyright is discussed and shaped and all that, that means to also ramp up some of the capacities that GLAM institutions have right now to sort of intervene in the public conversation about copyright, right? And that's kind of an important aspect of that. Like we actually need, so open access is not only about, let's put everything online. It's also about your institution being more mindful about how copyright works across the board, right? And how can you actually, be part of the conversation, I think, with informed opinions, in a way. So I don't know if we would like to speak more to some of the challenges that appear, or how should we proceed now?
Yeah, I suggest we talk about challenges a bit more.
I just want to add something to what Scan just said, because I think that something that I missed to highlight in my presentation was really also the fact that you don't need to work with all your collection just to start your open GLAM journey. So the numbers that I revealed around our Wikimedia collaboration are for right now, I think it's about 5,000 images. But we have a collection of 700,000 works of art, and there's nobody's gonna, or very few people are gonna ask for the other, what is it, 655,000 works of art that we still, or 695,000 works of art that we still haven't provided in high resolution and under open licenses. So I think it's, when it comes to this argument that, oh, but our metadata is so messy and our image resolution is so bad and all this, well, start where it's easy. Start with the collections that you have well documented and where you have good imagery around. It will most certainly also be the collection that the public is most interested in, and that's where you can start building on this snowball effect, because you get more recognition outside your institution, which means digitization and the digital collections will be a more important part within the institution, and it will be easier to push the institution's strategy forward towards a more 21st century approach to digital.
Yeah, and I think that Maja, would you mind going to the challenges slide again? Thank you. So I also think that kind of the thing that Karin is saying that I want to stress a lot here, right? It's like both Andrea and myself and like others have been like sort of sharing links on the chat over and over. And the reason why we're doing this is because we know these examples are out there, right? And so there's a lot of work that has already been done by these sort of pioneers, right? Like, of course, Karin is one of those, right, that has been pushing towards a more open approach to managing collections. But I think that's kind of the thing, right? It's like, it's not necessary that we need more case studies. What we need is actually extract the learnings from some of those case studies and be like, okay, this is the thing that I can apply at my institution, right? And these are the things that I need to do, and these are the steps that I need to take if I want to make this successful in some way or another. And that is also an important point to make, that every institution is different, but there are still some commonalities there. And so that's kind of the approach, right? I mean, like your director of the institution might be less prone or less interested in having an open approach. Your staff might be more reluctant to take a might not feel as comfortable as you feel with some of the open approaches, right? And so that's kind of identifying what are your stakeholders in the conversation, and then who might be your peers in having the sort of outside view that Karen was mentioning. So sometimes, you know, it might be that bringing someone from Wikimedia will help you make the case, right? But sometimes it might not help you at all. And so that's always like institution dependent, a lot on some of these things, right? Cool. And so maybe Maja was saying, maybe we could talk a little bit more about the challenges. And I know that one of the ones that I think it's like comes up a lot is the misuse of public domain works that here has appeared in like the fourth place. But it's sort of connected to the lack of attribution to the institution that did the digitization, right? And I think that one important point is like bad actors are gonna be, or sort of like this idea of the bad actors, right? Like the ones that won't give any attribution to the institution, the ones that will do things that you might find questionable with the works in the public domain. All these actors really don't care what license you put in the work that you're releasing to the public domain. So it's like, for them, it's actually like the same, whether it's in copyright or whether it's like CC BY or whatever, because they really don't care that much about copyright because they don't care about ethical considerations to begin with. And so that's like an important thing, because you might be deterring good actors that actually want to do like interesting things with the works, because they are actually the ones that might be more mindful about the things that you want to share. And I think that speaking about the problem of lack of attribution to the institution that did the digitalization, one of the good things that could be done is like sort of encouraging people whenever you build a copyright page on your own website to actually tell them how do you want to be attributed whenever they use a public domain artwork. So being super clear about what are your expectations, right? And some of these are actually not copyright problems. The lack of attribution is not a copyright problem, although it ends up being sort of connected. Yes, Karin.
I just want to add to that, that also the goodwill and recognition that you will earn from going open, at least now around the peers, will outweigh the lack of attribution, actually. So what we see a lot is like all this love, you know? So IKEA shares an image from our website, and people ask, where can I buy that image? And this reaches, IKEA's answer reaches an audience that we never reached with our own efforts. So I think that's something to actually remember that. And another thing to remember is that the artworks that are shared throughout social media where are they attributed to the collecting institutions, right? So I think there's a different thing to that, because when you post an image of the Mona Lisa, you seldomly attribute the Louvre, and still everybody knows. And I think that's another point to this discussion, that when your artworks, or I mean, I'm from an art museum, that's why I talk about artworks all the time. So, but when your artifacts actually are out there and sort of are much more a part of the digital realm, it means that people will recognize them, and at some point they will get interested into where does this actually come from. So I don't think the missing attribution is such a big problem, actually. So try to keep this in mind, that you know, when your artworks get more known, almost automatically the institution will also get more known. Right.
Thank you all. That's a great discussion you built among yourselves. We don't have that much feedback from panel from participants. I'm quite curious of what they think, but maybe we'll get some feedback afterwards. But with that, we reached the end of the webinar. So we'll be sharing everything, including all these great links that Scan has been posting on the chat. We've got a lot of reading to do. So we'll be sharing this afterwards with the recording and the slides. And thank you so much all for participating to this webinar, and special thanks to our great panelists.